Pay close attention. What you're about to see is Bible prophecy being fulfilled.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you news as it relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yisrael Hawkins. Well, we've got Iran in the news today and the sanctions, the ongoing sanctions with Iran, but not just how it's affecting Iran, but a lot of the countries that depend on Iranian oil imports, as well as Iran being able to do business in moving other domestic products in and out of its ports. We're going to talk a little bit about Venezuela. We know that they're struggling as well with economic problems, them also not being able to buy and sell oil. And one of the former Soviet presidents, Gorbachev, makes some mentions on some of the things that he sees taking place at this time period that's pretty concerning to him. And lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about the peace plan, which we know is coming up very, very soon.
The unveiling.
That's right. The unveiling of that has the global community on the edge of its seat to see what Jared Kushner actually has to say about this. But first, we're going to start off with Syria, which has been struggling to supply its country with oil after the war left the majority of its oil infrastructure damaged, of course, from those wars, and the main oil and gas fields are outside government control. It has been importing 80% of its oil, mainly from Iran, until October, when tighter U.S. sanctions stopped the flow of oil into the country. Russia could help Syria, but so far it isn't.
Well, Tufik Shuman, a political analyst, said that Russia isn't assisting the Syrian government with fuel oil, using this to put pressure on Syria and Iran, wanting Syria's military, political, and security decisions to come from the Kremlin.
Well, Syria gave Russia control of a commercial port in Datrus for the next 49 years, and it seems Russia is replacing Iran as Syria's main oil supplier. Oil isn't the only thing keeping Iran from profiting in Syria. U.S. sanctions are making it difficult for Damascus to expand its markets in other countries as well. U.S. sanctions are weakening Iran's footprint, which is making it easier for Russia to convince the Gulf Arab countries and the West to reintegrate the Syrian government.
Well, even Syria's neighbor, Lebanon, can't send them oil because of the government not issuing permits because of the sanctions on the country. Now, Iraq hasn't had the land trade routes for oil, as it's thought that the U.S. has been playing a role in not allowing passage of oil from Iran to Iraq and Syria to Lebanon.
Syria can't send merchandise to ports because of the U.S.'s control over these land corridors. These attempts to block Iran's regional goals aren't new, but many don't know what effects they might have in the long run.
Well, America in the next few months will see that we will continue to export our oil. Now, this statement made by Iran's President Ayatollah Khomeini recently. Now, he continued, they might close one path, but they don't even realize that there's 6 more doors that are open that they aren't even aware of. We must export our oil powerfully in the face of U.S. pressure. Now, Iran has responded to U.S. economic pressure with rhetoric at home and diplomacy abroad.
Since the U.S. has said that it will not extend waivers to allow Iran to sell oil to its partners, Iran has hinted at slowing traffic in the Strait of Hormuz, where an estimated 20% of the world's oil moves through, and the mere mention of that name, Strait of Hormuz, can affect global markets. With tensions rising, Iran has battle-ready ships in its southern waters of the Strait of Hormuz, where battleships have the job of policing traffic through the straits while looking out for American warships.
Right, and that is a major pathway for the oil distribution in that area.
Right, right.
Well, Iran says that the Strait of Hormuz belongs to Iran and it's in control of the contested waterways. Now, this is why it's taken such measures to ensure that the U.S. or any other country doesn't try anything to take that control away. Iran wants others to know that if pushed, it will fight back, as reminders of war relics lay in ruin from wars past. So Iran's goal is to hopefully get the other countries to think twice before trying anything in what they refer to as Iran's own backyard.
That's right. By having those ships there, they're letting other countries know that we're ready to fight back. Well, as the waivers expire for Iran to export oil to its 8 biggest customers, speculators are expecting an oil market shakeup. Those countries, China, India, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Turkey, Italy, and Greece, will soon be receiving no oil from Iran, as the U.S. has proposed to not extend those waivers, bringing the country's oil exports down to zero. The U.S. is seeking new sources of oil to not hurt consumers, and Saudi Arabia has promised to boost oil output as needed.
Well, Qatar's foreign minister spoke out against U.S. sanctions, calling them unwise, and said the sanctions should not be extended because they have an adverse impact on countries benefiting from Iranian oil. Now, Qatar is also the host of the largest U.S. airbase in the Middle East.
Iran's oil minister said that Saudi Arabia and the UAE can't supply the world on its own. The oil markets can't be controlled with words alone. It's ultimately real production and offering it to the market that's the deciding factor. The extra capacities and reserves that Saudi Arabia and the UAE talk about are exaggerated, he said.
Well, even though Trump tweeted that he talked to Saudi Arabia about increasing oil production, oil cost has already jumped 30% in the first quarter of 2019. Now, OPEC is making moves to prevent oil prices from falling again. In 2016, OPEC cut crude oil production by 1.2 million barrels after finding that inventories had surpassed their optimal level by 27.1 million barrels a day. Now, that surplus has now shrunk to 7.5 million barrels, putting the market back in balance. So Saudi Arabia depends on this balance to cover its domestic spending from oil, which is its biggest source of revenue.
Well, this coupled with sanctions on Venezuela and Iran, experts say that these moves might not be felt immediately at the pump, but eventually we can expect to see higher prices this summer.
Well, we now go to our field correspondent, Larry McGee, who has been covering the latest on Venezuela. Now, Larry, what is the U.S. saying recently about the protests in Venezuela and the recent coup attempt to oust the president there of Venezuela?
The U.S. is willing to lend its full support to the coup still raging in Venezuela, as indicated by a recent statement given by Secretary Pompeo that all options are on the table regarding Caracas. At present, the country's troops are working hard to hold the line as protests for the removal of the country's president and the establishment of democracy slither into their second day. Thousands of demonstrators took to the streets to announce their determination to achieve what they believe is freedom. Among them was self-appointed President Juan Guaido, who called on the country's military to switch allegiances, but to no avail. And what analysts are calling a battle for hearts and minds, both sides of the conflict have turned the nation's capital into a war zone. The strongest piece on the board is the Venezuelan army. At this point, their support is functioning as a determining factor in the conflict. As day 2 of the uprising came to a close, President Maduro, flanked by the country's top military personnel, took to national television to claim victory. The United States ironically claims that the democratically elected president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, is presiding contrary to the will of the people. National Security Advisor John Bolton commented to reporters that they need Venezuela ruled by the people of Venezuela and not by external forces. That last phrase is what many people are finding laughable, since by all reliable accounts, the whole affair in Venezuela is a product of U.S. meddling. In evidence of this, analysts are quick to point out that it is the U.S. more than any other nation which is pushing for President Maduro to be ousted. To this end, America has sanctioned Venezuelan oil, frozen billions of the country's funds, and are now suggesting military action if the government takes serious steps to address armed protesters. Advisor Bolton is also calling on the Venezuelan armed forces to stand with the people, and the current administration says it will do the same as well. Yet for its willingness to impose sanctions which hurt millions of Venezuelans in an effort to remove a president who was democratically elected by its citizens, there are serious questions as to what people the U.S. supposedly stands for. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Good time, Jeff. Back to you.
With Venezuela, what we see there taking place, as well as with some of these other countries where heavy sanctions have been put on those countries, really it's the people that are suffering, and sadly they're the one to pay the highest cost from this political tit for tat to get countries to do what other countries want to. And it's sad to see that, because they're kind of stuck. They don't have the resources to even purchase their food, clothing, and shelter, medical resources. They don't have the resources to go to other places. And this is, of course, why we're seeing a huge influx of people moving from not only South America into northern countries or countries in the United States or in America, but we also see the same thing taking place in Syria, Iran, and other countries. They're making their moves because they don't have any other choice.
Right.
They want to survive. So hopefully we'll see some changes in the coming months. Well, the White House staff is saying President Trump has initiated contact with President Putin on the topic of nuclear arms agreement between the two countries, as well as China. This comes after the United States decided only a few months ago to stop honoring the decades-old INF treaty, which we have reported on, that was signed by Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev.
Now, just last month, Mr. Gorbachev contributed an editorial to the Wall Street Journal, which he titled "The Madness of Nuclear Deterrence." Now, in the article, Gorbachev implores both the United States and Russia to quit using nuclear deterrence as a way to find peace. He writes, "The idea of more weapons makes us more safe is just mad."
Those are words of wisdom right there. Relations with China, which haven't been the best over the last year, are potentially strained even as the United States decides to end waivers for countries who have still been purchasing Iranian oil, including China. In Dalian, a very important Chinese seaport, approximately 20 million barrels of Iranian oil are waiting to clear Chinese customs. But due to the end of the waivers, it's uncertain if they will make it through for use in the country.
Well, now the issue at hand is the U.S. has threatened to put sanctions on any and all countries who continue to buy oil from Iran after May 1st of this year. Of course, this includes China, who is Iran's biggest customer. Now, Beijing has argued there is no justification for this policy coming from Washington. In a statement, the Chinese Minister for Foreign Affairs said China firmly opposes the unilateral sanctions and the so-called long-arm jurisdictions imposed by the U.S.
In recent years, China and Iran have grown closer. Iran sells nearly 25% of its exported oil to China, which equals about 500,000 barrels a day. Iran is also a key supporter of China's Belt and Road Initiative. To show their solidarity, just a month after the U.S. had begun imposing sanctions back on Iran, the leaders of the two countries met in Beijing.
Now, despite their strong ties, analysts are saying China may have no other options but to bow to U.S. demands. Now, one professor at Beijing's Renmin University explains the United States is serious for China to pick a side. The Chinese government has to be very careful.
The timing couldn't be more critical as top negotiators arrived in China's capital for trade talks, as the tit-for-tat tariff war has only been escalating since last year. Negotiators are working on a deal to put an end to them. Experts speculate China could give up Iranian oil, which makes up about 7% of China's oil imports, so as not to put the talks in jeopardy.
And even though they are great friends with Iran, analysts say China has a much more important relationship to maintain with the United States. But even if they stop buying Iran's oil, China could look for other ways to compensate Tehran. Now, they could boost other areas of trade or continue importing oil through a back door or barter for it with other products.
At this point, though, China has not indicated it will stop buying Iranian oil, which leads to speculation that it could be used as a bargaining chip with the U.S. during negotiations. But at this point, Washington has clearly stated there will be no additional waivers for Iran oil sales to China.
Well, the long-awaited peace plan coming from the Trump administration is expected to be unveiled next month. Trump's senior advisor, Jared Kushner, has been a key architect of the deal and recently gave new details about the plan, including the status of Jerusalem since the U.S. had moved its embassy there this past year.
Kushner, speaking at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy event, explained his conversation with the president before the embassy was moved. He commented, "When we made the decision to recognize Jerusalem, the president asked, 'Will this make your job easier or harder?' And the answer I gave him was, 'Short term, I think it's probably harder because people will be more reactive and emotional. But in the long term, I think it helps.'"
Well, he continued by saying Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, and that would be part of any final agreement anyway. So there is definitely no change on the White House's view of Jerusalem. Now, as for the two-state solution, many Democrats and Republicans believe the peace plan must include this idea that both people need to have their own states. And of course, any previous plan have used, or previous plans have used the two-state solution as their cornerstone.
Trump's team, however, is turning this idea upside down and not committing to using this historic ideology. While the president has said in the past he does like the idea of two states, we heard Jared Kushner at the recent Washington think tank event say, "If you say two states, it means one thing to the Israelis and one thing to the Palestinians. So we say, let's just not say it. Let's just work on the details of what it means." And so this is how he plans to push forward in the new peace process.
So it sounds like what Jared Kushner is saying is even though they're not going to call it a two-state solution, they know that the Palestinians, to them, two-state solution means one thing.
Right.
To the Israelis, it means something else. So they're going to look at what both sides are referring to because they're not agreeing, right. Even though it seems like a pretty simple idea that, okay, each one has their own state. Each party is looking at it a little bit differently. So Mr. Jared Kushner, he says, well, look, let's just leave it out. We won't call it that, but individually we'll look at what either side wants and incorporate that. So it sounds like it still has all the parts of the two-state solution, even though they may not call it a two-state solution.
So ultimately, it's the results that are really going to matter at the end of this, because so far, several administrations have tried but not been completely successful in getting both sides, the Palestinians and the Israelis, to sit down and to totally agree on a process to get this back in action again.
Right. Either way, as you said, for years there have been past administrations trying to accomplish peace there in the Middle East and have failed. But we won't have to wait too much longer. Next month here is that big unveiling, and then we'll see the reactions. I'm sure we'll get the individual reactions from the Israelis and the Palestinians, but we'll see the global reaction from everybody as this peace plan is unveiled. So if you'd like to find out more about this peace plan, you can contact the House of Yahweh, and when you do, don't forget to request your free copy of the Prophetic Word magazine and monthly newsletter. Here's how.
To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at the House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. Visit them on any of their websites by going to Yahweh.com, YisraelHawkins.com, or Yahweh'sBranch.com. You can also visit our website by going to YPNnews.com. You can email the House of Yahweh at info@yahweh.com. And for all calls outside the United States, please call the number on your screen. And as a reminder to all you Bible scholars out there, don't forget the Yisrael Says and Ask Yisrael program, as the greatest study tools online to the Holy Scriptures. You can find those, again, free online by going to YisraelSays.com and AskYisrael.com.
Well, don't go anywhere. Up next is another enlightening message from Yisrael Hawkins. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
And I'm Katan Alexander.
Thanks for watching.